Hello, and a very warm welcome to you all, and a warm welcome to our panel of guests today. My name is Michael Charles, and I am a solicitor, and I'm the Chief Executive of Sinclairslaw. And this afternoon, we welcome you to our special needs conversation. This presentation is a bit different from the ones we've had up to now, as we'll be hearing from three very wonderful people who are currently or even having currently struggles with navigating the special needs and social care maze. And in order to preserve some confidentiality, I will not be mentioning surnames today, but we are delighted to have with us Laura, who will be talking today about her 12-year-old child, Frankie, who has a range of disabilities, and she has had real battles with securing getting adequate support for her child. And we also have Claire with us this afternoon, and she'll be telling us about her super daughter Alice, who has autism, and the problems that she has experienced with her local education authority. Lastly, but not least, we have Delina, who has a terrible time, and she's had a real battle trying to get support for her daughter, who is in year 11 and has an eating disorder. A very warm welcome to you all, and of course, a very warm welcome to also our specialist panel of members. And we have with us today a number of very great specialists. I mean, we have Leon Glenister, and he's a public and planning law specialist at Landmark Chambers. And he's a specialist in public law and regularly acts in high profile and very complex cases. And he's acted even for the case of Alfie Evans. You may remember that case, and the challenge that was made to the Yorkshire Rippers move from Broadmoor to prison. And he's appointed, or has been appointed, to the Attorney General's panel of counsel and regularly acts for the Secretary of State and is also on the Equality and Human Rights Commission panel of counsel. And as you don't know him, because I'm not sure he's been with us before, I'll give you a little bit more information about him. He's recorded in the Legal 500 as being a leading junior in administrative and public law, education law, of course, and planning law, and he's described as incredibly bright and able to get to grips with cases very quickly. He's also a tutor in administrative law at the Faculty of Law in the University of Cambridge, and he's also a contributing author to both children's social care law and adult social care law. So a very good afternoon also to Leon. We have Charlotte Hadfield, my go-to barrister. I always introduce her as that. And according to the leading directories, she really doesn't need any introduction. I mean, according to my PA, Beth, she says that Charlotte is lush. That's what Beth says about her. She's the head of 3PB's education law team, and her main specialism is in public law and particularly education, of course, otherwise she wouldn't be with us today. But she also specializes in social care law, and she complements that expertise in employment cases and professional disciplinary cases that she's also acted in, and she regularly accepts instructions in respect of all of those type of cases, and she's represented teachers before the NCTL, and she's also represented solicitors who've been naughty and have been accused of things before the Solicitors Disciplinary Tribunal. So a very good afternoon also to Charlotte. Welcome again to her. So whenever you need anyone to assist you in the legal cases that often cause us all such terrible headaches these days, we have a great panel today. And of course, speaking of go-to people, we also have Melinda Erickson, who's one of the top occupational therapists in the country, and she's worked with children in education now for over 20 years, and it's fair to say she's very passionate about ensuring that all children are provided with the best support they need in order to meet their individual needs. So regardless of any barriers they may face in order to become independent, Melinda's your person. She's the one who will help you become the confident learner that you need to be. So without further ado, I think I should introduce our first guest, and that of course is Laura. So Laura, a very warm welcome to you, and I look forward to hearing your story this afternoon. Laura, good afternoon.
Hello. Oh. I'm just waiting for Dan to let me back in. Hello,
there
everyone.
You go. Hi, Laura, how are you?
Little bit nervous, but Dan,
no, don't.
go-to man with technology and helped me massively yesterday and today. So we're all up and working, which is wonderful.
Well, a lovely afternoon to you, Laura. So tell us all about Frankie.
Oh gosh, where to begin? So Frankie's a 12-year-old girl now, and she's got extremely complex needs. So over the years, we've had a number of diagnoses, and it still has been a massive battle to try and get her needs met via education and social care. So Frankie was born profoundly deaf into a hearing family. So this immediately threw up a question about how to communicate with her, because I've got no experience of deafness whatsoever. And as I learned more about the world of deafness, it became more apparent that she'd have to undergo surgery for a cochlear implant, which she had when she was 18 months old, after a trial with hearing aids, which was unsuccessful. And so I had to go and study British Sign Language at college, a night school, which is very much like learning GCSE French, is what I'd describe it as. So it wasn't necessarily appropriate to communicating with a baby, but the instructor was very, very helpful. As years went on, things became more and more complex, and the professionals that were involved just kept telling me all of her issues are just down to a deafness. And in my gut, I've always sort of known that can't be true. So I pursued some further assessments. Just like many other families, they've probably been through the CAMS system, and I got to the point after a few years where I just thought I need to seek some help. So we then received the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, and then later she received a diagnosis of pathological demand avoidance, which I'm sure many people have heard of.
Where did the PTSD come from, Laura?
So unfortunately, Frankie suffered some trauma from her birth father. So we separated when she was 3 months old, and as you can imagine, she was a non-verbal child. So when she was going between care, her care needs weren't met as what they should have done, and behaviours sort of arose. And obviously, as she became a toddler and got a bit older, it became worse and worse and worse. And again, I kept being told it's because she can't communicate, it's because she's deaf. But no, we did get involved with specialist deaf CAMS helps, and they diagnosed her with post-traumatic stress disorder. But that, to me, that still wasn't the answer. I thought there's still something else going on. And then we ended up having an autism assessment privately, and she got diagnosed with pathological demand avoidance, which I tried desperately to say, no, it's not that, because I knew that was going to be even more difficult. And then add-ons then came about: sensory processing disorder, developmental language disorder, and a visual processing disorder. I'm sure many people do understand about pathological demand avoidance, but part of it's about the anxiety-driven need to be in control. Well, a child with deafness who wears cochlear implants can take a cochlear implants out and control the world even more, which makes communication quite a big battle with her, because when she's upset and distressed, she might not want to look at you, so I'm not able to always sign with her, and it's just become more and more difficult. So as years went by, we had a rehabilitation officer involved who came into the home and did a specialist assessment for some equipment that she needed as a deaf person. And she highlighted that actually, because of her visual needs, she met criteria for being a deaf-blind child. It's an awful term, and it's not that she's blind, but her visual impairment and her hearing impairment meant that she'd got a dual loss. And she referred it back to the local authority and said, this child needs a multisensory impairment assessment. She meets deaf-blind criteria, but they did nothing. So throughout those years, I lived in a constant conundrum of, should I sign with her, should we not sign with her? And then came up the questions of schools. She'd been in a mainstream school, and then as things proved more and more complicated, that the needs couldn't be met in a mainstream environment anymore, then the battle came to, well, should she be in an autism provision or a deaf provision? A deaf provision, they didn't have the experience with the autism, and the autism provision didn't have the experience of the deafness. So it was left with the battle, but the local authority took the decision out of my hands and decided to place her in an out-of-county specialist school for autism, who actually specialised with children with a profile of PDA. She goes in a taxi every day with a chaperone, and the distance is between an hour and 30 minutes every day, and she's extremely dysregulated. We've got a long list of professionals involved, from the school staff, psychologists, occupational therapists, HI teachers, behavioural optometrists, rehabilitation officers, multisensory impairment teachers, audiologists, speech and language. The list could go on. And over the years, as being a single parent, and I've got 2 other children, I requested back in 2014 a social care assessment. And I did this repeatedly for many, many years and kept getting told she didn't fit criteria. In 2018, they finally admitted that she did meet criteria, even just on a deafness alone. And they never gave us services that could meet her needs. And by the summer of 2019, they classed her as a child being on the edge of care. And they agreed to commission an assessment from a specialist multisensory impairment consultant. When we spoke about direct payments, it's always been aware that someone as complex as Frankie, the pay scales that would be needed, even for somebody that would need to communicate with a deaf person, they would need a higher rate of pay. But in addition to that, they would always need to understand her trauma, her PDA, her sensory deficits, and this has always been ignored. So 12 months ago, they commissioned a report, the MSI assessor did, and the LA have still continued to not meet these needs. They've not provided the support. We've never received a satisfactory social work assessment. The social workers never gained my daughter's views. They've not gone and spoken to professionals who are involved in Frankie's care, and it's just merely been a paper-based activity, and I've just been given verbal reassurances. They've never offered myself a carer's assessment, nor either of her siblings who are actually classed as young carers. Last year, we had an annual review. Social care attended, as with all the other professionals. It's always a very lengthy meeting with lots of professionals in the room. And then the LA used no information from that report, those reports that were given. And then I've ended up now appealing the contents, and I'm due to go to Tribunal in the near future.
Good on you. Good on you.
I'm hoping to win a battle, but I still feel a bit defeated. Yesterday, I've received yet another child social work assessment. Obviously, what they're going to submit for the Tribunal. The last one was completed in 2019, and they agreed it wasn't fit for purpose. And this, yet again, shows that this person has no understanding of her needs whatsoever. Not any of them. The provision she attends, as I've said, meet the needs for children with a PDA profile. So she's got to have a greater staff ratio, but they also have no experience of deafness. And we're now in a situation where the speech and language therapist there has got no experience of deafness, and they have no experience of any visual impairments either. The school have been supportive, but as it is an out-of-county placement, the county that she attends wouldn't offer us any provision, and it was left to our home county to provide support, and they've not given us any direct input. So Frankie's now lost meaningful relationships, which has caused further traumas to her. The gaps in a language continue to grow, because as a deaf child, she needs to grow and develop a language with British Sign Language as well as English. I feel like all professionals, I'm sure many families experience this, they still won't specify and quantify reports. Nobody will comment on her needs out of school, even the ones that are involved. They might verbally say they recognise that she's got these needs, and you sit in a meeting and it's almost like the LA take ownership and make it sound like she only has needs 9 till 3 when she goes to school, but yeah, actually it's 24 hours of the day, 7 days a week and 365 days of the year. The tell it once approach is just non-existent. I feel like I have to tell my story millions and millions of times. Many of the specialists that she actually needs, most local authorities, or the ones that we live in, certainly don't employ those staff anymore. So they still exist, but the LAs don't spend any time researching and finding these people. Staff inside and outside school, they need to know all of her needs. It's not just when she's in school. So in school they're meeting her autism and a trauma, but they haven't got the deafness. And then outside of school, what social care do look for, they might try and meet maybe just one need, and then they don't offer a budget to train her on everything. So it would just leave Frankie in a position. Since being there, we've had a lot of occupational therapy input. There's a amazing occupational therapist, and she spends hours. She has facilitated equine care, as well as all the things that needs in a school. But Frankie, because of her autism, she can't generalise the skills that she learns with it. And outside of school, her needs tend to increase because she can't cope with unstructured times. So the OT has now said she can't comment on her needs outside of school, but she does verbalise and say that she absolutely needs these things.
So Laura, you're on your way to the tribunal, so that's going to resolve, one hopes, the educational side of things, presumably. But your case, what you've been talking about, raises two fundamental points, doesn't it? I mean, there's the social care part of it, and then there's the education part of it. Leon, what do you think about the social care part? Because, of course, we've heard there Laura's been saying she's been struggling to get a social care assessment. She's been struggling really to get any kind of specific social care plan. What would your advice be, Leon?
Yeah, I think social care is an interesting one with tribunal proceedings. So until about, depending on your area, about two to 4 years ago, roughly, there is a legislative framework, the Children Act 1989, and there's specific guidance on social care assessments for children. And the recourse was always to take it to judicial review, i.e. review in a court the assessments that have been carried out. Now, what happened for most authorities in 2017 was, as I think the road that you're going down, Laura, which is to ask the tribunal to make recommendations. And it's been a bit of a rocky road, I think, and different tribunals respond quite differently. There are clear limitations to the tribunal's ability to deal with social care issues. One is that even if it makes any recommendation, it's only a recommendation. And the local authority can simply respond in writing and say, we don't adopt your recommendation, essentially. That's one issue. The other issue is that Section H of the EHC plan only relates to social care needs relating to SEN. So obviously there are a wide array of social care needs that don't relate to SEN. And tribunals, I think, have just dealt with this differently. I think for Laura, I think if you want something simple like a full assessment, I think that is exactly the sort of point that tribunals are actually quite receptive to. It's quite simple. It doesn't defy logic. It's quite logical. So I think that's the sort of thing you can ask for. I think the problem is you don't, as I understand it, because the assessment's not happened yet, there's no specific provision you're after, because you want to see what the local authority say is provided first. But I think for you, that kind of simple recommendation of getting an assessment, which is simply the first step, is a perfectly legitimate thing to do through the tribunal. And if the local authority hasn't done an assessment, as you say, I'd be surprised if the local authority didn't, if the tribunal didn't order it.
The local authority have completed, they've continued to complete assessments, but what they don't do is they don't specialise in a need. So Frankie really should have a specialist deaf social worker, because they would understand her deaf needs. So they do, every year a new social work assessment's produced, but they don't ever speak to Frankie and gain Frankie's views, and Frankie's, you know, able very much to say what she wants out of her life and what she needs. But it's never fit for purpose, and it never meets. Frankie's just come into the room.
That's all right. Don't worry.
Just come and say hello, Frankie. Just sit down, say hello, and then you can leave. Frankie's been wanting to know about this experience. I've told her that, you know, we're getting lots of help this week. And we're going to speak to some very famous people.
Well, I mean, I was going to say, Laura, what I was going to say was that, firstly, really, Charlotte, you probably agree with me that she doesn't need to go to the tribunal to get an order for an assessment, because they should be doing the assessment, and they should be doing a proper assessment with the right people to be able to inform that assessment. And the idea really, I think, is to try and be clear about what it is that you want from social care, so you can actually be more specific about the kind of thing you want to see in the plan, and be absolutely clear about what you're wanting to achieve in the education plan too. Charlotte, you agree with me on that?
I think so. Sorry, hello, Laura.
Hello.
Hello. So as far as the social care is concerned, it sounds as though they have done an assessment, and the problem is that you've looked at that assessment and you don't think that it really takes into account what Frankie actually needs. And you've also said that you're not convinced that the social worker who has written the report is even really communicating with Frankie, because you said that they don't really speak to her to get her views. Can I ask, is Frankie verbal? I think you said that she does vocalise.
She does use sign, but she's also an oral child. And when last year they did pay for a specialist. So when you're classed as deafblind, there's actually specialist criteria. I can't remember what the Social Care Law and Act was,
no,
but
there
is specific law that says that she's entitled to that form of assessment. So we had that assessment done, and that person has come back and explained that she needs input from lots of specialists, visual impaired teachers, rehabilitation officers. She even quantified hours. She's quantified that she needs an intervener, a 2-to-1 ratio. So actually we've had quantified expert input, and that person is only allowed to do that on social care elements. But despite the local authority receiving that, they've not acted upon that. So even when I've had a report, they didn't then put it into what was supposed to happen is they were meant to put that into a social care assessment and also collaborate with all the other professionals. So even though we've had things that are quantified, they don't give you those things. So I feel like the assessment was pretty pointless, because I'm still, even when you've had an assessment and they've identified many needs for it, we're still no further along the line. So even at Tribunal, they might say, can you do another social care assessment? Well, for me, I just fear that that's just going to mean another paper-based activity with no outcomes and no provision to meet the needs.
And when was the specialist deafblind assessment done? When did that person come in and assess?
Last summer.
Okay, so that's not too far out of date. I think that Mike's right. I think that what I would advise any parent to do really in this situation is to go along to the tribunal and say, here's an assessment that was done at this time. Here are the things that this assessment says my daughter needs. Here are the things that have been done, if there are any. Here are the things that haven't been done. This is what I want to be put in the social care recommendations. And you can literally lift those out of the assessment that you've got and ask the tribunal to put them in. Now, whether or not the tribunal will do it is obviously going to depend on all of the evidence that they hear and on what the local authority experts say. But I think if you've got an assessment from a deafblind specialist that has made specific recommendations for Frankie in terms of social care, then it's really important that the tribunal looks at those at the same time that it's looking at the more general social care assessment that you've got, because then the tribunal will understand exactly what specialist provision you want. I mean, I think you've got a lovely, unique, I was going to say a lovely, unique little girl there, but I think Frankie might feel she's a bit too old to be described as a little girl.
No, she's taller than me.
But you've got a lovely, unique girl there with, as you say, quite a complex range of needs. And that, I mean, I really sympathise with you on the choice of school front, because I can see how difficult it must have been to think of somewhere that she could go. Do you mind if I ask how the school feels in terms of how Frankie's doing, whether they're able to meet her needs and so on?
I think the school recognise that they can meet her PDA and they can try and support her through a trauma, but they are very open to say that they're aware that they're not meeting her deaf needs. So they've now advertised for their own, they're going to now recruit their own teacher of the deaf. So where in her EHCP at the moment, she has like an hour a week quantified in it. That's not been received. Frankie's had no direct input from them. They've just communicated with the school, and it's like, you can't, how does the school not know what they've got to do if they don't understand what a deaf person needs? So they've been very supportive, and they've now advertised themselves, and they now want to have someone there, you know, half a day a week, because they recognise that they're not meeting those needs.
Well, there's a fundamental obligation on the local authority, as no doubt Leon will say, that when you're doing an assessment of a child who has those sensory difficulties, to have obtained expert evidence from the experts who are particularly trained in those fields, both visual and in hearing. Leon, that's right, isn't it? Regulation 6 of the 2014 regulations.
That's absolutely right. There is a list of things. If it's a SEN assessment, then there's a list of things in the regulations. If it's a social care assessment, then there is a framework and government guidance on it. And I think the stark thing for me that you said is that the views hadn't been obtained, which to me is almost like a starting point. So it seems like there's a flaw in the assessment. And I think, as Charlotte says, in terms of the practical advice to give is if you have these assessments that recommend certain things that aren't being delivered at the moment, then it will depend on the evidence, but that seems perfectly reasonable to ask for those to go in the EHC plan to be delivered.
So, of course, there's the social care aspect. What I'm struggling to really gain from the information, Laura, is precisely what it is that you're seeking from the tribunal. I do gain an understanding clearly that the social care part of it is really poor and you're not getting much help from them. But I'm not particularly clear about what you're saying is wrong with the current school. I know you say that they can't meet all of the needs, but what particular areas do you say that the school can't meet? Is it the environment that's wrong? Is it the expertise in the
No, I think she's very fortunate that in the school is an amazing school and they're very flexible. But because they've got no previous experience, how a deaf child learns and how a deaf child communicates, and also a child with visual impairment communicates, when you don't know what you don't know. So they might feel, and Frankie's not really engaged that much in academics since she's been there. I mean, children with PDA do need a lot of flexibility, and obviously she has got the ability to go off and do horse riding, but she needs to grow her language as somebody who uses British Sign Language. That's no different how we would learn English. She needs to learn English and British Sign Language.
Yeah.
And her visual needs affect her so much that she can't, when somebody's teaching you to sign, they might sit in front of you, but because of her visual problems, she can't interpret that information. Yeah. So somebody needs to understand that on so many levels, so that the people who would teach her the sign language need to understand the visual impairment. They also need to understand how to form a relationship because of a traumatic history. And then they also need to understand that when you're teaching a child with PDA, you can't just, it doesn't work, you can't just give them a piece of work and say, we're going to do this. There is so much level of understanding, and it's got to be novel. So even, you know, a specialist in deafness, they would need to understand all of her other needs. And I think that's where you hit roads, because to me, all those professionals need to understand all those needs, instead of it just being that she would have a weekly visit from somebody. Those people also need to be able to communicate with all the other professionals, because you've got to look at it as a whole, not as just this is one disability and this is another disability. Yeah. And I just feel like it's a constant cycle and a constant battle. Yeah. And you know, one of my big concerns is what section, when all these people, and this is going to be education and training Francesca, or education and training other people. Really, should that not go in the education part of the HCP as opposed to it being in the social care? So does that make sense?
Yeah. Charlotte, quite a simple answer to that. The question is, where does each of the provisions go in terms of the plan? What do you think about that?
So it's one of the things that the Children and Families Act is really clear on. There is a section in the Act, section 21.5, which says that so basically it recognises the overlap between social care and education and health. And what that section says is that if you've got social care provision, but it has the effect of educating or training the child or young person, then that is what we call, this is such a lawyery thing to say, that is what we call deemed special educational provision. And because of that, it should actually go in section F of the plan and not in section H. And the advantage of that is that section F is directly enforceable in the tribunal. So if it goes into section F, it's not just a recommendation, it's a legal statement of what the child or young person should have. So in other words, Laura, if you're looking for, I think the most common situation will be something like, you say you want Laura to, you want Frankie to extend her understanding of sign language, for example, and perhaps in the assessment that the specialist deaf-blind expert did last year, perhaps they might have given provision for that. I don't know, but perhaps one thing might be, you know, to go to groups for the hearing impaired, to have opportunities to practice sign language outside of school and so on. And that's provision that you could argue should go in section F, even though the local authority might say that it's social care provision because that's how they would see it.
Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you. Laura, I'm thinking of time, and I'd like to invite you to stay there, because what you really are saying is probably going to cross the boundaries of what other people are wanting to talk about too. I mean, so I think we're going to be answering the same question on multiple occasions, I suspect, from looking ahead of what Claire, for example, will be talking about shortly. I mean, I have a very clear view about from what you're telling the audience today about what you should be looking for. It's quite clear to me, it seems to me, Melinda, what this is a problem. I think this is a problem about the need to integrate and consistently apply a regular kind of support across not just merely the classroom, but into the wider settings. So she's generalizing skills across across different settings, isn't it? And it's about integrating and ensuring that the support that's available from expert teachers, from occupational therapists, speech therapists, and people who are specialists in hearing and visual impairments, making sure that's a consistent program that should be written into the education and healthcare plan. Melinda, we see that all the time, don't we, in terms of occupational therapy techniques?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that Frankie, hi Laura, sorry, hello. I think that, as Charlotte said, Frankie's obviously incredibly complex, and it's going to be unlikely that you will get a single professional who is an expert in every one of her areas of needs, because she has so many. So as an OT, what I'd be doing is, if I were the OT in the school whose expertise is the autism and the PDA and the sensory probably, liaising with an MSI from the MSI team, the MSI specialist OT, and combining your input, because clearly she does also need input at home, and I'm sure your OT is staying within the remit of what her workplace has specified, but all these things at home impact on education. So if she's not sleeping well, if she's not regulated, if she's traveling for an hour and a half each way, then all of this is actually part of her educational needs, and it absolutely generalizes across both environments.
So thank you very much, Melinda. I mean, Laura, so pretty much you're going off to the tribunal, you're going off to challenge also to ensure that social services are properly providing within the plan. I mean, it's very difficult to determine where the borders are, because of course social care issues will overlap with education overlapping with social, and you really want to ensure the proper integration of services, and that's what the local authority obligation is, because we see it in the legislation. It's actually in section 25 of the Children and Families Act. So what I would be trying to do, if I were you, would be to making sure, looking very carefully at your plan, making sure it's obviously specific enough. The tribunal will want to ensure that it is specific enough, because that's part of what the law requires, and making sure you get the right expert help for those particular key areas, because of course I said to you, regulation 6 of the Special Education Needs Disability Regulations actually provides that a local authority should be obtaining certain key pieces of information, not just merely information they think is off the top of their head relevant, but what the regulations actually require them to obtain when you're undertaking a proper and thorough assessment. So Laura, I'd like to thank you for your contribution, but please stay there, because there's going to be more we're going to be talking about, and when we give our comments in relation to Claire's case and of course Delina's case, there's a lot of things that we will say which will I think cross the borders from what which are relevant to you too. So please stay with us, and I would like to introduce Claire in relation to, of course, Claire, who has a daughter Alice, who's 15 years old, and Claire, I think she is also experiencing problems, because in Alice's case, she has autism, and again I think it's PDA, if I'm not mistaken. Claire, please, you can correct me.
No, that's right.
And you're having problems. You're on a waiting list with CAMHS, I think, and you've been on that list for 2 years. So Claire, over to you. Tell us a story about the wonderful and gorgeous Alice.
Okay, we're not on a waiting list with CAMHS though. We've been under CAMHS from around about 2012. like Laura, just failings all over the place, but I've tried to narrow down and do a little bit of a summary for Alice. So Alice's story spans 8 years of decisions that have left her without an education or the correct provision to enable this to be provided. To summarise all this is impossible, so I'll list some of the most impacting failures. My daughter had a breakdown in school which left her on a part-time timetable in March 2012, year 2. Her statement of educational needs was written prior to her diagnosis, providing generic strategies for high-functioning autism. This was year 3, around October 2012. In November 2012, she received a diagnosis of classic autism with PDA. Her statement was not revised to add the complex level of her diagnosis and the specific strategies a person with PDA requires. A referral for dyspraxia in her diagnosis was refused by the NHS OT. The LA did not action anything in regards to this in her statement. In year 3, she was again on a part-time timetable, not coping in school. An interim review was done. No amendments were made to consider the complex strategies that are required for her difficulties. School admitted they could not provide an education at this point. The LA autism team admitted they had exhausted all avenues. The LA decided she did not require a special school, that 6 hours a week part-time with no other support was an adequate education. No amendments were considered for her PDA to add to her statement at all. And we were not informed of the decision to refuse the special school.
Can I just ask you, Claire, did you ask the local authority about its policy in relation to PDA?
At this point, we were just overwhelmed. We just had the diagnosis. We didn't really know what on earth was going on. We knew nothing about special educational needs and so on. So we were just being led by the school. We had no clue. Nobody in the meetings, nobody was saying that.
You mentioned, sorry, Claire, you mentioned that they wouldn't, unless I'm mistaken, you said that they wouldn't accept the diagnosis of PDA. Was that right?
No, they didn't amend her statement to add any of the strategies at all, or to add PDA to her statement.
That's what I mean. So they didn't accept it.
So I'm presuming they didn't accept, but verbally they did. So
I think that was similar to Laura's case, I believe. I think Laura was saying the same thing, wasn't she? Mm. Sorry, carry on.
Okay. So no more reviews of the statement have ever happened since that one in 2013. By September 2014, year 5, she'd been on a 6-hour timetable, managing 40% of this since year 2. She'd had enough and refused school completely. So from September 2014 to April 2015, she was left at home with no contact from anybody, not school, not the LEA, nobody. By April 2015, I forced a placement at the local National Autistic Society school. They did an assessment of needs, but the LA did not take this into account, didn't review her statement before starting the school, and wouldn't fund the one-to-one support that highlighted at all. That placement failed. Well, it was failing in December 2015. By February 2016, she'd become mute. She was sitting on the floor, rocking in school, unable to eat or drink or go to the toilet, and was part-time again. That placement broke down. Her statement has still not changed since it was written in 2012. The NAS school began the transfer to the EHCP in February 2016. She was in year 6 by then. But she was too scared to go back to that school placement, so that ended, and the LA didn't continue with the transfer to EHCP. It then took the LGO to force the LA to complete the EHCP transfer, which included commissioning private assessments. These showed she had dyspraxia, dyslexia, dyscalculia, sensory processing disorder, hypermobility, and possibly ADD. All this had been missed, which I put down to being due to being on a 6 hours a week timetable, and with no or inadequate reviews. It took from 2016 to 2018 for the local authority to finalise her EHCP. She wasn't in school. Information since has shown that the schools she attempted to attend during that period had been provided, it was the wrong information. The placements all failed within weeks of attending. The consultations the local authority did to all the schools just contained minimal wrong information, and in fact didn't even state her primary diagnosis of autism. So it is possible she missed out on the correct placement at that point. There's loads and loads and loads more failures. There's no time to list them all. At the moment, she's got a further diagnosis of Tourette's and panic disorder, and she is medicated, has been for a while. Alice is highly intelligent and capable individual, but due to these failures, she's academically year 4. The LA have also not yet provided any prep for adulthood from year 9 onwards. We had a review in February, which I've heard nothing about since. I requested further assessments for her EHCP to be commissioned because we're running out of time. She still has no sensory diet, which was highlighted as a requirement in 2018. No ADD assessment yet, and is displaying PTSD symptoms. They said no, they wouldn't commission any private assessments, and we'd have to go the CAMS route, despite Alice being, she just won't access CAMS. She can't cope with it. She's had really bad experiences there, and they don't know how to manage her at all. The LA were informed of that at the time. Basically, my daughter's journey in education has left her traumatised, and her life chances have been devastated completely. She enters year 11 in September, not much further forward than when she started in year 2 with her breakdown. There is much more to it, but a lot of it I wouldn't like to say on here.
Well, Claire, you've mentioned so many things there. There are clearly multiple breaches. Leon, I'm sure you can find some of those breaches and tell us about them. So over to you in relation to identifying some of those breaches.
Well, one of the things just to pick up on from being, hi Claire, sorry, I didn't introduce myself to Laura, so sorry about that. One of the things, one of the current issues that you're facing, which is probably one of the more helpful things, is the reassessment. And I understand what you've sought is further assessments at the moment. Now, what I've recently come across this, and I'm interested if Mike or Charlotte have dealt with this before, but the local authority has both a power and a duty to reassess under the legislation, which is the Children and Families Act 2014. And what Section 44 says is that if a parent requests a reassessment, as long as it's not within 12 months of the assessment last having occurred, then the local authority must carry out that reassessment. And when that happens, my understanding is the way the law works is then it becomes an assessment under the regulations Mike was talking about earlier, the SEND regulation. So you have a right, as far as I can see, to get that reassessment with the reports that you want. So if if the local authority are prevaricating on that or delaying, I would suggest referring them to that, because I think you have that right to reassess. So that was what I would say is if that's the big issue at the moment. I think there's
the difficulty there is the local authority will say that it must go through the normal routes, i.e. CAMS, NHS, OT, that kind of thing, and we haven't got time to wait. The waiting lists are massive, and that's been the issue. They've refused to commission private reports to make this quick process for Alice because she's already missed out on so much, and they're insisting that we go with NHS, OT, we go with CAMS, even though she can't access CAMS. And then they've left it at that because we've tried with CAMS, we went ahead and tried. So then you get to the point where
Claire, what Leon was saying was that Section 44, he was talking about the wording of Section 44. I mean, this is often an excuse that's given, Leon, isn't it? Well, let's go through this channel. Let's get the speech therapist to make the recommendation, go back to the GP and get the recommendation to go to CAMS.
Yeah, I mean, I have local authorities who want to use NHS services. I have some sympathy with that. It's simply a cost-saving exercise. But the problem is they're often they're stretched. And so if they can't deliver those reports in time, and the legislation sets out timeframes, if they can't, then unfortunately for the local authority, they do have to go to independent people. It's not an answer to say we have to use the NHS OT and SILT. It's not an answer to say that, because they've also got timeframes to meet. So that's not really, it's not an answer. The short point is not an answer. The only slight caveat, what I would say, is that one of the impacts of what the Secretary of State has done because of the COVID-19 is that he has relaxed some of the timescales on carrying out assessments. So they may fall, the local authority may try and play those, but there are quite strict restrictions on that. The local authority can only delay in terms of the timescales. They can only delay on the timescales if it's not reasonably practicable to carry out them in line with the normal timescales, and that is, in my view, quite a high hurdle.
Melinda, we've heard about the sensory processing difficulties. We've heard that now on the 2 cases so far. I mean, it's very difficult, isn't it, to get or find an occupational therapist that might be available to undertake that kind of assessment. They rarely do detailed assessments on sensory processing, do they?
Yeah, I think it's quite difficult to get within the NHS. There's less qualified or advanced sensory integration qualified OTs, but they certainly are around. I know when I was in the NHS, I did my initial training, so they do fund training for a lot of their staff. But I think one thing that's just coming up so much is it's just evident that children's needs have to be met. Otherwise, it's just repeated failures in both of these cases in placements. If their needs are not identified, the placement can't meet their needs.
I mean, it goes straight to the environment too, doesn't it? I mean, of course, if you have sensory processing difficulties, the first thing I would look at whenever I'm advising anyone in relation to these kind of cases is to look first at the environment. What's wrong with it?
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, Charlotte, the other point that is interesting about Claire's case, I mean, she's looking at it from 2 perspectives. There's one about looking backwards and saying, well, look, what hell that we've been through over the last couple of years, and she's being let down in so many ways. I mean, one thing that was completely shocked me really about Claire's case is the failure since 2014 to even undertake an annual review. I mean,
yes.
Maybe I shouldn't be shocked.
No, I was quite surprised. I mean, hi, Claire. I have to say, Claire, that as you were going through it, I was thinking, surely she must have her EHC plan now. But I see that it took an awfully long time for you to get it. Yeah, I mean, that is, it's not, I mean, well, Mike, we know it's not necessarily uncommon for EHC plans to, well, certainly statements could remain unchanged from year to year for quite a long period. And then for some children and young people who transferred over to the EHC plan, it was basically just what the statement said transferred into a new format. But it's very surprising, isn't it, that there wasn't any kind of review given everything that has been happening to Alice over those last few years, and given that she's been receiving 6 hours of part-time schooling a week for
years,
for a long time. Sorry, I'm just trying to go back since 2014. Can that be right?
Since 2012 until probably 2018, she was in no schooling.
And then since 2018, no provision.
2018, we found an amazing provision, a therapy first child-led provision where she was the only pupil.
Yes. Sorry, you did say that in what you sent to us. Yes.
Yeah. And then we've had a few. We're going back there now. We had a bit of a blip where Alice felt she was capable and ready for more because she's always wanted to be in school, but because of all the past, she just couldn't pull it enough together. So we're going back there soon.
Yeah.
But
at the moment.
The point here, Claire, is similar to Laura's, is that there does not appear to have been proper compliance with statutory duties, and there does not appear to be proper compliance with gaining the right evidence that you're supposed to gain when you're doing a statutory assessment. I mean, one must not forget, and I've said this many, many times, although the lawyers, and even you know, the newspapers, etc., are not really reporting so much about people who are going and taking local authorities to court in negligence. And we can't forget the what was then the House of Lords ruling in the Phelps case, Leon. I mean, the House of Lords made it quite clear about what they expect of local authorities.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's right. I mean, educational negligence cases are in principle possible. My own view is they're very difficult. And I think the better way to deal with things is on the as they're happening, and looking back is always much more difficult, but partly for emotional reasons, but partly because legally it becomes much more difficult to challenge. And the reason, just very briefly, the reason why that's quite difficult is because what you will be seeking, a civil court, if that's what you're going down, will be looking at what financial loss you have suffered, and it's really crude. And a failure to educate or to not get provision, it's very hard to prove in numbers what that's cost, and that's why it's quite difficult. But I think the key here in these points, so the local authorities has a duty when there's an EHCP to deliver the provision that's in the plan. If it's not delivering it, it's a pretty straightforward legal challenge, genuinely quite straightforward. Section 42 of the Children and Families Act, you just go under that, then the local authority will be in breach. And if a placement breaks down, which happens, and I think happened in your case, I think everyone just needs to go back to the drawing board and find somewhere else, because firstly, the local authority has a duty under Section 42 anyway to deliver the provision, but there's also a Section 19 of the Education Act 1996, which is often cited, and that's essentially if a child is out of school for any reason, which would include a breakdown of a placement, then it needs to take other steps to educate. And take reasonable steps and sufficient steps. So it's those kind of things that you can do. And actually, when this is happening, I know this is not of current use to you, but it may be going forward, is the way I found the quickest action is taken is when you get a pre-action protocol letter off for judicial review and then have a first hearing, because when you get an urgent hearing a few days later, by that time, it's escalated in the local authority, and the local authority then come with some kind of provision map of what they're going to deliver, and that's usually the easy way. And because these cases can sometimes get legal aid because the child gets legal aid, there's no cost risk to you. So that's my overriding sort of advice would be to make sure you consult lawyers as you go, and it's much easier to deal with things up front than try and look back, because it just becomes both emotional and legally.
I think for us though, the difficulty is that the decisions made by the local authority did leave Alice with no education for so many years. They did.
Yeah,
we can't afford, we don't get legal aid, we can't afford to go down the route of, you know, solicitors and so on. We just can't.
I think I might be wrong about this. Mike is probably the person to ask about this, but I think that where you're talking about a judicial review, so a judicial review is basically what we call a public law remedy, where you go to the High Court and you say the local authority had a duty under this act, here it be Section 42, as Leon has said, to secure the provision in this plan. It hasn't delivered the provision in that plan. Please make them deliver the provision in that plan. And as Leon says, with that kind of case, often just issuing the letter before claim, the pre-action protocol letter, will achieve what you want. Some local authorities might not focus on it before the claim is issued, but as Leon says, frequently by the first hearing, the local authority has had to think about it because they're going to be hauled into court and asked by a judge what they're going to do. So I think frequently when it's a am I right about this, Mike? If it's just a non-provision under Section 42, I think that legal aid for the child, I mean, it all depends on individual circumstances, but I wouldn't necessarily say you wouldn't get it. I think it would be worth looking into. I think the bigger problem, though, is that Section 42 is very effective when you've got clear enforceable provision in the plan. So if you've got a plan that says this child should have an hour of occupational therapy per week for the whole of the year, so 38 or 39 hours, and the local authority doesn't get that provision in place, then it's fairly straightforward. I think it's harder if you've got a plan that's full of things like Alice would benefit from having an adult to share her feelings with, because then when you go to the High Court and say they said we'd have this, the judge may well look at it and say, yes, but I don't really know what that means, and who is this adult and how much time are they supposed to be spending with her? So a lot of what's key is sort of really kind of focusing your efforts on getting the content in the EHC plan right. And I think that's the difficulty that you're having at the moment, isn't it? Because you're not getting the assessments that you need in order to inform what should be in the plan.
Yeah, I think it is twofold. It's looking at the past and what Alice has lost for her future. It has been lost, and that's something to look at. But looking for the future, we need to get these assessments done to make sure that going forward, she is getting the correct provision. If you can keep building her life towards what she wants it to be. So there is two separate things here I'm looking at. Yeah.
I mean, if it were, I think so far as educational negligence claims are concerned, it's a claim that would be brought in Alice's own name, because it's Alice who is the person who has experienced the negligence, and Alice is not yet 18.
No.
So you would have to be, you would, if you're thinking about an educational negligence claim, it's important to get advice on time limits early. But usually a claim like that the time limit wouldn't start to run for it until the young person was 18. So to some extent, and as I say, I really do emphasize it's important to get specific, sorry, this is a really lawyery, disclaimery thing to say, it is important to get specific legal advice on time limits for yourself. So I can't be specific about how they apply, but it's worth checking whether you have to think about the educational negligence claim at this stage, because it may be that you can park that until Alice is a bit older, and you can focus on getting the provision that she needs in her plan and rectifying the current situation that you have, so that Alice can then start to progress. Because as Leon says, an educational negligence claim, they are hard to prove. They're not technically impossible, but they're really difficult. Because as Leon says, how do you value the loss of an education? It's difficult to, it's the problem you always come up against. But the other thing is that what a civil court will give you if it thinks you have suffered educational negligence is money. And money is great, but Alice actually really needs to take advantage of her time as well. So
I think Charlotte, you're right. I mean, Leon's point about focusing on the present, and then of course, if the present action that you take doesn't resolve the problem sufficiently, then you may have no choice other than to look also at the past to see whether or not we have to do something to compensate. But one of the primary problems that are often experienced in educational negligence claims is the failure on many people's part to document precisely what has happened and when, and the evidence looking back at what actually happened. And then
documented. It's all documented.
Well, that's good. And then trying to work out from what has happened then, did it cause the current problem? Because it is quite complicated. You have to demonstrate what's called causation, and then you have to demonstrate your loss, and it is quite complex, but it's not insurmountable. I got to say, it's not. And but I agree. It's absolutely right that focusing on the present, making sure that she gets the best possible support here on, is the best piece of advice that we can give at this stage. And of course, and at the same time, keep documenting your evidence. I've said this in bullying cases and done some seminars online. You may have seen them, but it's the same in bullying situations. I mean, people just don't always keep documents. They don't actually write to the school and recounting what the school may have told them. I've always said, keep writing back. Tell people what they've just said. Charlotte, you have seen that too, wouldn't you? In special needs cases, even people just sometimes don't record the evidence sufficiently enough.
And it's very, very difficult to. I mean, oral evidence is really important. What people say and what people remember. But if you're able to point to some sort of contemporaneous document, even if it's just an email that you sent at the time, that's going to be very powerful evidence of what happened in a way that your sort of unstructured recollection and evidence isn't going to be.
We've got it documented from 2012 onwards. Fortunately, everything's through email, through the system. Everything is documented. Everything, their decisions, school letters, everything's, fortunately for us, has been via email. So the whole thing from 2012 onwards is documented.
Well, Claire, thank you very much for your contribution today. Again, just like Laura, please stay on and just to hear what others are talking about, because again, some of the advice that we might give will be similar and be applicable to you too. Delina is the mother of a delightful young lady who's currently in year 11, and we're hearing a similar story time and time again. Really, the difficulties that people are having trying to get the right advice, the right support, the right words written into the education healthcare plan, the right acknowledgements from the school, the right evidence. Delina, very warm welcome to you. Your daughter is in year 11 and she has an eating disorder that was diagnosed, I believe, in January 2017. And I don't think she's been attending school since, really, has she? So
No,
please, tell us Delina's story. Very warm welcome to you, Delina. Tell us about your daughter.
Thank you. Hello, can you hear me? Yes. I'm a bit nervous, sorry.
Please don't. Please be
Firstly, thank you for calling all of us mums who've been on here today wonderful people, because we are. We live with this 24/7 and we fight battles every day and it's really hard. So thank you for giving me the time to talk. My daughter is wonderful. She's beautiful. She's intelligent. She's got a wicked sense of humour. She loves dance. And she's been let down by a lot of people, and mainly the school and the local authority. She was diagnosed, as you said, with an eating disorder in January 2017, and our life has changed unbelievably since that monster entered our house. And that monster we battle every day still. And what's frustrating is that we've also got a monster out there that's the school. Because they haven't followed what they should have followed. And if I knew then what I knew now, things would be different. However, as you said, you've been talking about, even knowing now these policies, this legislation, I still can't use that to do anything. And no one listens to it and no one's held to account. And I'm frustrated by what you've also been saying this afternoon in terms of it's hard to look back and ask for anything because it's gone. Anyway, I'll digress in. She has got an eating disorder. She still has it. And she's also since had severe anxiety and severe OCD. So if people say to you, what's it like living in lockdown? That's what I've been living like since 2017. I can't hug my daughter or touch her physically unless it's a day where she has a shower. So 5 minutes before she has a shower, I'm allowed to physically touch her and then she goes and showers. So we have to be very careful of what we feed her. I have to get specific brands of food. So when all the supermarkets locked down, that became very stressful for us because we had to get her the food. Anyway, she hasn't been able to attend school normally because of her illness, but also because the school didn't give her what she needed to be able to access it. She had many periods of time where she was absent for 15 days or more, either consecutively or not. And we weren't referred to the local authority to get alternative provision from the school. At the time, I was really grateful that the school said we were being educated other than at school, because it meant that I didn't have to make a phone call every day. And it also meant that I wasn't going to be fined. But in hindsight, what that then meant was that we didn't get alternative provision offered to us. I didn't know about those sorts of things, like the 15-day rule, until you sort of start looking at things. School never mentioned it. They sent one bundle of work home for her, but a lot of it was inappropriate for what she was going through at the time. And nobody followed up whether or not she did it or not. We again, like Claire, I think, was saying that nobody bothered to contact us. There was no real welfare calls or anything like that. We were under CAMS, but unfortunately CAMS didn't tie in with the school. And as I say, I didn't really know about it back then, what we should have been asking for. My daughter did get better. She regained her weight and she was able to go back to school. But we did it very much as sort of baby steps. I would take her in for one lesson a day and I would sit in the car park until she came back out. And we each week sort of progressed with another lesson. And eventually we got her back to relatively full time, except for doing things like PE. I would sit with each teacher. Again, it was all my initiation to talk to them about what she needed and how she would have a panic attack. how it would take her an hour and a half in the morning just to put her hair up in a ponytail so that she would have the confidence to go out to school. So she got there, she's really well. However, she then was suffered from bullying that wasn't dealt with in the right way. And the member of staff that's head of wellbeing, even though I'd sat with her for several hours explaining what my daughter needs, she pulled her up in front of the whole class about the fact that she was wearing little hoop earrings, and then my daughter hasn't been back to the normal class since. So we finally got to, in November 2018, she was in year 10. We asked for a meeting with the head teacher to say, look, she's better, she wants an education, she deserves an education. How do we get an education? Because a parent had said to me that you should get an IEP, but I now know they're called EHCPs, because the school recommended that we apply for an EHCP. So we applied for that, and I'm still waiting, 43 weeks on. I'm still waiting for my draft EHCP. It was promised to me on Wednesday, and I'm still waiting. I've put in complaints about it. I have phoned regularly, weekly. I've documented every single phone call that I've made, and I'm still sitting here without one. And that's when I sort of throw back to you and say, what more can you do as a parent when you're saying you haven't met these guidelines? And the fact that she hasn't got any HCP means that in lockdown, she's not seen as a child that should be in school. She's not seen as a child that has the right to have any sort of follow-up. And so again, she's just been left. So that's my point on the HCPs. My other problem is mainly to do with school and the local authority not giving an education. We're the ones that have sort of had to say, what are you going to do for her? And she was offered some home tuition, but it wasn't at the level that she needed. The people weren't qualified to teach her. She's a level 8-9 student. She's now only was entered for 2 GCSEs, unfortunately, because they didn't provide any teaching for any other subjects. And even though she is under the school and was entered for exams, still today, I do not know if the school are going to be submitting her for a GCSE. I've asked, are you going to be grading her? And all they keep saying to me is, we can't talk to you about that because it's confidential. I don't want to know what grade she's going to get. I just want to know if they're going to enter her into her exams. Anyway, I know that I'm really waffling now.
All right, it's all right.
I've been so emotional about all of this. I've attended so many meetings. I've got so many emails. I've got so much documentation. I have become so frustrated when they say to me things like, we are going above and beyond for you and your daughter. The fact that we are paying for you to have a home tutor, even though it's only 6 hours a week, and paying for her to have provision at school. I have been distressed in meetings because of frustration, and because I've cried at meetings, they then put reports into me, into the local authority, saying that I am of a concern to them. They did it behind my back, saying that it was because I'm emotional, it could possibly be my fault that my daughter has self-harmed and has many attempts at suicide, and they laid the blame at me. Again, I've got so many things I can talk about. I've got, they told me that she was on the SEN register. I did a SAR, is that the right word? No, data access report, whatever. Sorry, I'm getting all flustered now.
That's all right, don't you worry.
And I found out there's an email there that says, oops, we haven't got Molly on the SEN register, even though they promised me that she was on it. I've had no documents about being on the SEN register, no plan, no objective setting, no inclusion at all from us about what she needed, what support she needed. Does it matter if she's on the SEN plan? If she wasn't on it, does that really matter? She hasn't ever been included with school.
Delina, this is
Sorry, I can go on.
This is your first education healthcare plan, am I right?
Yes.
So it's your first plan. Charlotte, my word, she's been waiting all this time, bless her, for this plan. I mean, heavens. I mean, she also, bless her, Delina, she feels disillusioned. She thinks there's nothing that the law can do. Well, there is a lot the law can do, Delina, a lot. And I can tell you now, if your case was, if you were in my case load, you would have had a plan flying out like confetti by now. Charlotte, let's tell Delina what the law can do.
Hi, Delina.
Hello.
So there are, I think we've talked about timescales for EHC plans previously, I think, in the context of Claire's situation. There are pretty strict timescales. The whole process for issuing an EHC plan shouldn't take more than, I think,
20 weeks. 20 weeks.
That is how long it's supposed to take. Now, those timescales are split up into specific phases because there is the EHC needs assessment, at the end of which, so first the local authority has to decide whether it's going to do a needs assessment. Then it has to do the needs assessment. There's specific timescales for that. Then once it's done the needs assessment, it decides whether or not it's going to issue a plan. If it decides it's going to issue a plan, then there is a specific period for producing the draft plan, and then there is a further period for issuing the final plan. So how long ago did they confirm to you, how long ago was the end of the EHC needs assessment? Did they do the EHC needs assessment and then say to you, we're going to issue a plan?
We had an educational psychologist assessment. Is that what you mean?
That would have been part of it. That would have been part of it.
That's all we've had. We had that on the 17th of February this year.
Right.
I've had nothing formally since about it. Nothing to say that they've received that report. I've had a copy of the report from the educational psychologist.
Right.
I've phoned constantly since, and all they keep saying is the same excuse. We've got such a backlog. We can't do anything about it. We're such a backlog. So I've not actually been told formally, apart from on the phone, that there is a draft being written and that it should have been with me on Wednesday.
So they haven't actually told you yet that they have decided to issue an EHC plan?
Not other than there's a draft being written, but nothing on. I've got nothing in paper. All I've got is log of all the calls that I've made. At one point, because obviously we're in lockdown, trying to get hold of them, they don't have any telephones apparently, so they can't call me. They're working from home, but all via email.
So the answer is that you can, I mean, we'd have to, I think this is another of those sort of cowardly lawyer disclaimers, isn't it, Mike? But I think we'd have to see the papers to work out what the timescales have been. But if they are in breach of the timescales, again, you can send them a letter before claim, a pre-action protocol letter, saying to them, you're under a statutory duty to issue a plan by X date. You have missed that date. If you don't issue the plan within, say, 2 weeks, I'm going to go to the High Court and I'm going to get the High Court to make you issue the plan. So
is that a letter I can send? Because I was listening to one of your webinars a couple of weeks ago and I couldn't understand what you said. So now you've said it clearer. Thank you.
Well, we tend to just call them pre-action protocol letters without really thinking about it. But basically, there are general rules that if you are going to bring a claim against pretty much anybody in the civil courts, you are supposed to start by writing less formally to the other side and saying, hey, you're in breach, you've breached the law in some way, you've done something unlawful. Here's your chance to rectify it. If you don't rectify it in X number of weeks, then I'm going to issue a claim against you because that's the only way I can get this sorted out. Anybody can write one of those letters. I mean, I suppose I would say this because I'm a lawyer. It's probably easier if you get a lawyer to write it because we know how they're supposed to be written and we have, you know, more sort of tactical nous. But anybody can write one. You would have to look up online what the requirements are because there are different pre-action protocols for a number of different types of claim. There's one specific one for judicial review. So you would need to look it up and make sure that you were putting in all the information that the pre-action protocol says that you should.
I did a complaint through the process that I went on to the Children's Services and did that, and it got upheld, but that's it. So how much, you know, again, like others were saying, I had to give up work to look after my daughter, you know, and she gets disability living allowance, but I don't get carer's allowance. How much do these things cost?
That's probably more a question for Mike than for me because he's got more of an overview on it. Mike, how much do these things cost, and what's the legal aid situation in a case like this?
Firstly, legal aid is available for people who qualify based on their means, of course. If you're not at work, generally you would expect to qualify. And you could get legal help in order to cover the early stages of your case, to include the writing of the letter, if you yourself qualify, because that would be written on your behalf as parents. And if your child is above the age of 16, your child can apply also for her own legal help, and her means, of course, would be taken into account. But if you are dealing with a child that's younger, and you want to get some support for legal help, or at least you can't get legal help, let's say, as a parent, because you may have savings or you may have assets that take you over the threshold, you can apply for legal aid in the child's name, because of course it's the child's right to have provision and so on. Legal aid can then cover you for bringing your action to the High Court, and that will be obviously covered by that process. I mean, judicial review, whenever you're thinking of writing letters for judicial review, it's always important to write them with a lawyer's help. Because, you know, those who play with fire, you can get burnt. And that's the problem. I mean, Leon, we see it all the time in judicial review, don't we?
Yeah, I think it's a classic lawyer thing, you know, trying to say, because obviously it's in our interest that we do it. But I think that the one reason why it is quite useful to have a lawyer doing it is because, particularly in this sort of instance, where all we're asking for is the local authority to send you the plan. It's not particularly onerous on the local authority. A well-written letter will usually solve the problem. It's not like we're looking at some huge claim here. A letter will probably solve the problem, and so that letter should it's useful for it to be written in a lawyerly way, but also actually just getting it on the headed paper of a solicitor's firm will help, because the local authority will take it more seriously. And that's just the reality of the situation. As Charlotte says, you can write it yourselves, and a lot of people do write pre-action protocol letters by themselves. But if you just want it sorted very quickly, it's often actually cost efficient to do it with a lawyer, because you get it sorted so much quicker than not getting sorted.
Melinda, from a therapist's perspective, having heard about Delina's daughter's case, do you think there's anything you'd want to contribute to the discussion there, given what we've heard?
I think that I know in the information you sent us, Delina, you spoke about the limited knowledge schools have about mental health issues, and it's clear all over the country that they're not meeting the needs. Mainstream schools aren't trained in this area, so having that expert knowledge from an EHC plan is absolutely essential, because it is all about training. You don't need to make huge physical adjustments or anything like that, but properly trained staff can change a child's life.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Sorry, Delina, please come on in.
no, I was just going to say, you know, I've been told by the local authority that they were paying for these home tutors. We didn't want home tutors because we wanted her to go out of the house, because the more she stays in, it's a barrier to going through the door. But we had them coming in, and the first thing they were talking about is, oh, you like dance, Molly? Oh, I need to do some exercise. I need to lose some weight. I've got a little bit of weight down my tummy, you know. And it's just, that's not how you engage with a girl that's got anorexia, and it causes more harm than good, really. But I guess as parents, we don't know all this stuff. How can we help parents like us so we don't have to go through this again? I've written to the governing body because the head teacher didn't answer my questions. I met with the chair of governors and had a 2-hour meeting, and she wrote the minutes, but nothing has been followed up. Nothing like the 15 days has been followed up. So I know that there's a policy somewhere that holds the governing body accountable for making sure these sorts of things happen. what can I do about that? What can I do about the fact that she didn't have her SEND needs met by the school when they could have done it? It doesn't cost anything. Some of the things she needed didn't cost a penny. They just needed their resources changed around. What can I do about these head teachers, these SENCOs that are not doing their job? They've had a major impact on my daughter. If you tell me it's not worth the battle, then fine, I won't waste my resource. But they're going to do this to another child. They are in jobs of responsibility. It can't go on. What can I do?
Leon, what would your headline advice be in those circumstances, having heard Delina's story?
I think my headline advice would be to, well, at this point, your best bet is the EHCP. I mean, that what you're sort of tipping on the edge of, hopefully, you're at this. What I would hope is the start of the end, because once you get the EHCP, and it sounds like there is going to be an EHCP because we've heard that there's a draft. So once that's in play, then you can then try and look at what provision's been given and whether you're happy with it, and maybe look at a tribunal appeal. I don't know, but you then have an enforceable set of provision that has to be provided, and so then it becomes irrelevant what the school staff are saying about it, because the local authority's duty is to deliver and secure that provision. So I think my overarching point would be, get over this little bit, get the HCP and see if you're happy with it, and then hopefully that will be the start of the end. That's what I hope.
Sorry, Leon, but
no,
get
sure,
over this little bit.
Yeah.
It's not good enough. Sorry, that's not good.
Not what? Sorry.
Getting over this little bit, it's more than that. This has had my daughter's taken 2 GCSEs. That's not acceptable. She's a capable girl. Why, if there's a 15-day rule there for alternative education and that wasn't delivered, do I just let that go?
I think what Leon is saying, Claire, is he's not saying that the past is in any way minimized. What he's saying is that there's a hurdle ahead of you now. There's a light at the end of the tunnel, and that's taking the form of an education and healthcare plan. And that's what I think he means by the little bit. That it's,
yes, exactly. The little bit. Sorry, I absolutely didn't intend. No, I fully understand. And often, I think as lawyers, sometimes it's once you sort of just zone in on the small steps that can be taken to try and solve the bigger issues. And I think this is one of those small, well, it's not really a small step, it's quite a big step, but it's that little thing that we can, then hopefully the rest will start to fall in place, and then you'll be getting the provision. And then, as we discussed before with Claire, I mean, the important thing is the now and the future to try and rectify what's gone on. We can always look back later to try and look at other issues, but I think in getting it now, I think the HCP genuinely will, I hope, solve a lot of the things that you've been talking about. That's
Leon.
Yeah, sure.
Sorry to interject, but can I just back up from a parent's point of view?
Yeah.
My experience, Frankie had a statement when she was 2 years old. I've always said, since having it, the one thing that all parents need is a code of practice and then baby packs that they give you, because we wouldn't be in this position now. And if they did that, that would help. But the EHCP, we battle for so long to get the EHCP. And I don't know whether I should say this because I don't know whether I mean it, but my experience is you have a massive fight to get one, and then actually there's even a bigger fight to get them to actually complete what's in the plan. It's a no-ending battle that you battle to get it. And I know you're going to say that the law's there, but actually, for us as a parent's point of view, you think that you've got there. Oh my God, the HCP's come through and we've got this magic document, and it goes to school and it goes in a filing cabinet, and then nobody reads it. The staff working with the children don't read it, and especially in a high school.
Well, you see, Laura, there lay, I think, the fundamental problem. I mean, we have to roll back and think about where it all starts. When you are asking a local authority to produce an education healthcare plan, the most important bit of information that I can give you is to ensure that they do that assessment correctly. And I said earlier when we were talking at your stage in the presentation that the critical thing to do is to ensure that they take the time to get the right experts to give the right advice in relation to what should go into the plan. And what we're often seeing is this lots of misinformation on the streets about, you know, my education healthcare plan is not worth the paper it's written on, or that the school has not done this and the school has not done that. I mean, that's not to say that the school hasn't, of course, but the fundamental problem is a school is there to teach, to support, to do exercise their best endeavors to meet the needs of a child, but they are also there to take on advice, to listen to advice, and the local authority is supposed to be helping them do that. And unless you get the right evidence to feed into the education and healthcare plan, you end up with a plan that is really not worth the paper it's written on. And one thing that I think the theme that's coming through in all of the cases this afternoon is that there's a lack of information and quality evidence that's going through and being fed through into the education healthcare plan. And then when we get to the education healthcare plan stage, it's important to make sure that that plan is written in specific terms. And of course, parents won't know how to do that because they may not necessarily write like lawyers do. But if a plan is written properly and if it's properly policed, you don't need to do that much to police it. But a prime example would be, you'll see it often in education healthcare plans. Let's assume you've got all the expertise that's available, and the advice has come through. If an NHS consultant, for example, an NHS occupational therapist, Melinda might say that an occupational therapy program should be involving direct therapy for a child, for example, and an NHS therapist might say, well, actually, we haven't got any occupational therapists available to do that here, so we're going to recommend program only provision. And the program only provision is one that goes into the education healthcare plan. And really, a school then will simply say, or worse still, they might often get discharged. And the school might often say, well, actually, all it says in the plan is an occupational therapy program that we're supposed to deliver, and we haven't got the skill to deliver it. Melinda, we see that all the time, don't we? In terms of occupational therapy, that's a common thing. It's the same in relation to speech therapy. It's the same in relation to specialist teaching. It's exactly what Frankie needs, this kind of multi-agency support. It's exactly the kind of thing that Delina's daughter requires, a multi-agency approach to meeting multifaceted difficulties. And it's exactly the kind of support that Alice needs in Claire's summary, isn't it? And if the local authority stick to obtaining the right advice at the right part of the process by sticking to Regulation 6, by getting all of that and listening to parents, you'll end up with a plan that's actually worth the paper it's written on and can be enforced in law. Sorry, Melinda, I was talking a bit much in terms of the introduction, but it's the kind of thing that we see all the time, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like in many of the tribunals, I could just record myself and play it for every single one, because we're always arguing about this being more specific and giving the children the direct input that they need from a specialist, a staff member, from a therapist.
I mean, if we take those needs all together, we've heard of PTSD, we've heard of autism, we've heard of PDA, we've heard of hypermobility, we've heard of dyspraxia, dyslexia, dyscalculia, we've heard of anxiety disorders, eating disorders, motor coordination difficulties, and OCD. We've heard all of the kind of symptoms, what you would expect in those circumstances. Let me just give you a quick summary of what the law expects. Firstly, Regulation 6, if you are undertaking a statutory assessment, the authority should be undertaking that assessment complying with that regulation by getting the right advice. And if you're also complying with the duty to cooperate and to integrate services as the Children and Families Act requires, you would expect some good advice from health. You expect some good advice about how to combat motor difficulties. You expect some good advice about how to combat mental health difficulties. And all of that advice taken together should be fed into an education healthcare plan, which is designed to ensure to achieve the best possible outcomes that's available for a child. Look at Regulation 7, it says that in the 2014 regulation. So by getting this quality evidence, you feed that into an education and healthcare plan, and then sing Hosanna, you've got something that works. Charlotte, when you have something that works, when you have wording within a plan, such as, like Melinda is saying, occupational therapy that's delivered weekly, direct therapy delivered weekly, be it on the local authority's head if they don't deliver it. What do you say about that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, firstly, can I just say, Laura and Delina and Claire, I really hear you when you are talking about that feeling of every stage is a battle, and it feels like you've never really quite finished fighting it, because first you have the argument about whether you're going to have the assessment, and then you have the argument about whether you're going to get the plan at the end of it, and then you have the argument about what should be in the plan, and then possibly you have an argument about what school your child should be going to, and you might have that argument about schools more than once, because when children transition, sometimes the local authority might say, this child can now go to a different school, this child can move back into mainstream, this child can go to a different college, something like that. I mean, Mike is absolutely right. The key thing is, in terms of guessing what your child needs now, the key thing is getting a plan that is specified and that is quantified, so that when you look at it, if I should say, not when, because believe it or not, lots of local authorities, we hear the bad stories, there are lots of local authorities that do what the plan says, and where the process for getting the plan is a lot easier than the process you've described. But if you have a local authority who is not approaching it in that way, you want to be sure that when you go to the High Court to say, where is my child's special educational provision, you've got a plan where the High Court judge will look at it and then turn around to the local authority and say, this is very clear about what you're supposed to be doing, why aren't you doing it? And as Leon said, our experience is a lot of the time you don't get anywhere near that, because most of the time, if a judicial review letter before claim goes in, the local authority will hopefully take some advice then, and they might get, well, one hopes that they'll get a barrister who will come along and look at the plan and say to them, why aren't you doing what's in the plan? Or the solicitor might do it, because sometimes the local authority's lawyers don't necessarily know what's going on in the special educational needs department until a letter before claim comes in. So the bedrock of all of this is a really well specified and quantified plan. Now, if you are it sort of depends where you are, because different people have different resources available to them and different, I suppose, priorities. So some people might have one child, they might have they might be in a fairly secure financial position or a good financial position, and they might, at the point where the EH needs assessment starts, just say to themselves, right, I'm not going to wait for the local authority's EP to assess. It's fine for the EP, local authority's EP to go in, but I'm going to instruct my own educational psychologist. I'm going to instruct my own speech and language therapist. I'm going to instruct my own occupational therapist, and I'm going to have those experts on board and advising all the way. Now, if you do that, your ride through the tribunal system is probably going to be easier, because you will have those experts informing what provision should be right from day one. That isn't necessarily something that everybody can do. And so if you're not in the position to just get those experts around you and go forward with it, you have to be more sort of critical and careful about the advice that the local authority is giving you. Look really carefully at their assessments, push very hard for the assessments that you need, and be aware of things like, for example, if they're doing an EHC needs assessment, it's not acceptable for them to tell you you've got to wait for a referral to the NHS OT if that process is going to take more than the amount of time they have to do the needs assessment. So a lot of it is about knowing the ropes. Sorry, Delina.
I was just going to say, Charlotte, so I didn't interrupt you. I think as parents, I have been told that I can't use my own because the local authority wouldn't accept it. So when I knew that I had to have an educational psychologist, I wasn't allowed to employ my own because they wouldn't accept the report.
Well, that's wrong. That advice is simply wrong.
That's wrong.
And if what you might want to look at is, I just got it up on my screen here to help you. Let's just go through what Regulation 6 says, okay? Regulation 6 says that when a local authority secures an educational needs assessment, it must seek the following advice, and that is advice and information from the child's parent. You have something to say. You're the best expert. And too many local authorities are ignoring you. You're absolutely right about that. And they should be taking that into account. And on top of that, of course, so should the experts that you are expecting to undertake those assessments. They should be listening to you too. Educational advice, that means advice from the school and the head teacher. They will give a perspective. They may not necessarily agree with you. You may not necessarily agree with them, but they are entitled to give advice. And medical advice. Now, it says medical advice and information from a healthcare professional identified by the responsible commissioning body. Now, often what happens is a local authority will obtain a pediatric advice, pediatrician's advice, and that advice will be all embracing. Sometimes, and I've succeeded many times by saying, well, when that requirement is to obtain medical advice that is relevant to the issue, not just simple global advice, medical advice that is in fact relevant to what your problem is. And in this case, if you've got PTSD, you've got autism, you've got pathological demand avoidance issues, or mental health, more complex mental health difficulties, you'd expect someone to give a proper detailed advice in relation to what you should do about that. And that advice is not merely just to simply say, we've got a diagnosis. It's advice which is supposed to be interpreted in educational language so that it actually can be put in some form that makes sense into an education and healthcare plan. Okay, so that's the next thing they must obtain. Then you must obtain psychological advice, and then advice from social care. Now, how often do you not see a local authority that, well, how often do you see, I should say, a local authority that produces an education and healthcare plan that doesn't even have a social care input? We see it all the time. We've seen it in Laura's case, for example, and they should be doing it. And then when it comes to a child then you have any other advice from that the local authority might think is appropriate. Now, of course, that's what they may think is appropriate. That might include all sorts of different pieces of advice. It might include advice on classroom acoustics, maybe an audiologist maybe giving advice, or some other optician, whatever, giving advice. And then if a child is beyond the age of year 9, then you need advice and information in relation to the provision to assist the child or young person in preparation for adulthood and independent living. Now, we never see that, do we? We just heard so often. We've heard in Claire's case, annual reviews not being taking place, and at year 9 there should be advice from someone who's going to be looking forward about these kind of things, about how do you promote independence, etc. Hold the local authority to account in relation to that, because then they won't be able to give you the rubbish statements and education plans that we're all talking about and worried about. On top of that, if you have a child who's hearing or visually impaired, that includes advice that is from someone who's an expert in those domains. So they have to do that. It's in the regulations. And then to answer your question, it says, when seeking advice in accordance with the paragraph, the local authority must provide the person with, from whom the advice is being sought with copies of any representation made by the child's parents or the young person, and any evidence submitted by or at the request of the child's parents or the young person. So you are entitled to obtain your advice. That's your advice that you obtain. And you are entitled to expect that advice to be given the respect and taken on board when you are putting together the education and healthcare plan. And then what the purpose of undertaking at the consultation stage, where you're having a draft plan, is to enable you to contribute to that. And if you're looking at contributing to that plan, bear in mind the important obligation that's upon all local authorities to ensure the integration of services involving social, education and healthcare together, together to take into account a plan that will ultimately embrace all those different areas of needs in order to try and promote the best welfare, the welfare interests of your child. If we do things right, we don't have these problems. And of course, parents are totally right to say that they're being left out in the dark, having to fight these fights so many times. But the real truth is the local authorities, if they're taken to task, held to account to make sure they do these things right, we wouldn't have the kind of horror stories that we're living with. And I wouldn't have to be on Facebook as much as I am talking about all these stories, but maybe I wouldn't be in a job. But perhaps I'm too old now. I shouldn't care about being in a job. but you know, I think it's a common problem. I mean, we're seeing it all the time. And my heart goes out to all of you. Really, it really does. I mean, hearing about Frankie's story and so many different multifaceted difficulties not being addressed, and the quest to get a plan that really sort of embraces everything. Laura, I take my hat off to you. You've been such a fighter, bless you. And there's a lot more you can do. And please feel free to give me a call, because I'm very happy to talk it through with you. Okay.
I regret that, Mike.
Right, no, that's absolutely fine. Claire, same to you. I mean, Alice, bless her. I mean, she's going through a terrible time, and again, but I suspect that in your case, it seems to me that perhaps you know, that the point that was made about focusing on the present is probably all the more important for the moment. I think that would be my best advice to you, to make sure that that plan is right for her. But then, of course, never take your mind away from the idea of potentially looking back and saying, well, actually, someone's going to be held to account for this. So that's my advice to you on that, Claire. Sorry, you were saying something. You can say something.
The difficulty there is that the past has impacted so much that it's impacting now, and it's impacting the future that much that it's hard to just say, yeah, let's just do that, because she's traumatized, she's depressed, I'm
not saying, yeah, let's just go and do that. What I'm saying is, if you mitigate the loss, in other words, you try and do what's right for her now, as maximum support that you can get in for her now, maybe if we get the right help for her, she wouldn't have the same degree of loss that she would otherwise have if one was going to a court, because there's a lot you can do, believe it or not. It's never too late to help a child. Never too late.
That, but when you've lost everything from your whole primary school, you've not been to primary school.
I agree.
To suddenly at year 11.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, I think that you're absolutely right, and that you must be filled with a lot of anger and frustration and upset about that. I mean, I can understand that. Huge upset. But one thing I can tell you, and I think what Leon was saying is right, that the going through the courts in an application for negligence and making that kind of claim, it's really all-consuming. It's emotionally draining. It's financially exhausting. And it can be very stressful. But that said, I would never shy away from it in the right case. And from what you tell me, and from what you said, you talked about EHCPs not being reviewed since 2014. I would be really concerned about that. If you've got an evidence trail about not getting the right advice from the right people, not informing the school at the right time, that's why we've got a crisis on our hands today. But I think at the same time, although there's a crisis today, we can still work with today and do a lot today. That's my best advice to you. And as for Delina, I mean, the same again. I mean, she's going through a terrible time. It sounds to me a bit like that perhaps there's been some confusion down the road a bit about the timetable, because you said that the educational psychologist was reporting in around February, and I may be mistaken, but I think you said February.
February this year.
So it sounds to me like what's happened is that, I'm guessing, and I may be wrong, but it seems to me that you probably went to the school and asked for a statutory assessment, and also asked the school support for a statutory assessment, or or the school had said that there was going to be a meeting back in the November meeting in 2018 when you said there was a meeting. And I suspect you were given some advice that she should get an individual education plan. In other words, it's before you get to a statutory assessment. And you might have thought that was or later that was the setting in motion, the education healthcare plan assessment. But I only say that because it seems to be incredibly late, so that by February 2020 you get your educational psychology report. But you say in your account, I think you said that you submitted your story in relation to the education plan back in July 2019. So that tells me that around about that time in July 2019, you were asked to or to produce a contribution under Regulation 6 about your advice for a statutory assessment, and the authority would have taken approximately 12 weeks in order to have completed that assessment, which would have taken you probably until around October, November, which they seem to be terribly late in obtaining, and you're now on the eve of getting an education healthcare plan. I'd be very interested if you could send me that education healthcare plan, drop me an email and send it through to me. I'd be very interested to see what it ultimately says, and I'll certainly tell you whether I think it's worth the paper it's written on. Please don't feel so demoralized. This team today here, we're all here to try and help, and we do our utmost to help. And I post a lot of information, as you know, on Facebook and on other social media platforms. And the idea for me is to, and believe it or not, I mean, it's an irony really that I've been specializing in this subject for so long, and I had a beautiful son who turned out to be autistic himself, you know, and I had the same problem. And so I do know, not only am I a lawyer, I'm also a parent of 2 children, and I do understand, I can tell you, I do, and I understand it 4-dimensionally. Listen, I'd like to thank you all. It's been a long seminar. Leon, thank you so much for your contribution today, and welcome, of course, to our seminars, because I like to do these and we like to hear people's stories. Claire, thank you so much. It's been, I know it's very hard to give a story like you've had to deliver today, and my heart goes out to all of you, Claire, Delino and Laura. Thank you so much, and please keep in touch with me, and please let me know how you're getting on. I will be interested to see your education healthcare plans. You can always send them to me. I'll be interested to see them. If I can, I'll give you my view on them. Charlotte, thank you so much again. Thank you, our go-to barrister. You've been here again to help us. And Melinda, thank you also for your time this afternoon.
Thank you.
But I hope you've all found this useful. It's quite a long seminar, I know, but again, it will remain on our on my platform. It'll also be available on the Sinclairslaw site, and you can watch it again and have another watch party, apparently they called it. You can have a watch party and see it again and again and again. But and we'll think of other seminars. If there's things you want to talk about, you feel that you need some advice on a subject area, anyone, to all of you out there listening and watching, if you think there's something you want us to talk about, please let me know. Drop me an email, m.charles@sinclairslaw.co.uk. And if you've got a concern in relation to legal aid or any availability of for, you know, whether you're eligible, you can drop us a line at education@sinclairslaw.co.uk. And it all leaves me now only to say thank you so very much to you all, and thank you for watching. Good afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you.